Hello, everyone. Welcome to Advancing Adventism. The Hebrew word often translated soul does not mean what the English word soul means. Okay, now this isn't just an interesting tidbit about the meaning of a word. This is a hugely important subject because it relates to the scriptural view of human nature, and that has implications on a whole host of other subjects that are connected to human nature. The state of the dead, the incarnation of Christ, the nature of the resurrection, justification by faith. I mean, the list goes on and on. Now, by the end of this video, you should walk away with a very clear understanding of what this word doesn't mean and what it does mean. Okay, now, first of all, let's just make sure we clearly understand the idea of soul held by most English-speaking people today. The principle of life, feeling, thought, and action in humans, regarded as a distinct entity separate from the body, and commonly held to be separable in existence from the body. In other words, the spiritual part of humans as distinct from the physical part. Okay, so something maybe worth pointing out here before we move on is that with this definition, it's just explaining what the soul is supposed to be. It's not getting into the question of whether or not the soul is conscious after death. That's just a separate issue. This is just about the definition of the word soul. Okay, so that's the definition of soul in English. Now, let's look at the Hebrew word that's commonly translated into English as soul, and that's the Hebrew word nephesh. Now, as you'll see, nephesh means something very different from a non-physical aspect of humans that can exist separate from the body. For one thing, it's not something unique to humans, and it doesn't carry any connotations of non-physicality. All right, now let's start by looking at Genesis. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 20. And this is, the creation account in chapter 1. It's talking about the fifth day of creation, okay? And this is what it says. God said, "Let the waters abound with living nephesh." Okay, now clearly this is not referring to the creation of a non-physical part of humans. Now remember, this is day 5 of the creation account. Humans aren't even made until day 6, right? So when we're reading this and we see the word nephesh, again, that's the word that is commonly translated soul in our English Bibles. But this same word is often translated creatures. If you were to go get your Bible, you'd probably find the word creatures here as a translation of the Hebrew word nephesh. Okay. Now, obviously, the idea of a soul just doesn't work here. It's clearly referring to the animals of the sea that were created on day 5, okay? Now, a few verses later, we have another instance of the word nephesh. This is just verse 24, and this is still before the creation of humans. God said, "Let the earth produce living nephesh after their kind, livestock, creeping things, and animals of the earth after their kind," and it was so. Okay, now here again, it's very obvious that nephesh in this passage just can't be referring to an immaterial aspect of humans, right? The nephesh referred to in this verse is very clearly land animals, okay? Livestock, creeping things, animals of the earth after their kind, right? Humans aren't being created until verse 26. So again, this is just yet another piece of evidence to show that nephesh can't be referring to a non-physical aspect of humans. And this is why most English translations render nephesh in this passage as creature, not as man or human or anything like that. Okay. So next we're going to look at a passage that does refer to humans using the word nephesh. Okay. But here again, nephesh doesn't mean anything non-physical. Here's what it reads. "Yahweh God formed man from the dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the respiration of life, and man became a living nephesh." All right. So There's actually several things from this verse, Genesis 2:7, that are really important things to understand. And what we did was we went ahead and we made a short, specifically addressing this passage in more detail. And so here's the short. You can find it on our channel right now. That way we can just stay focused in this video on the meaning of Néfesh. Okay, so man became a living Néfesh. Now, according to this passage, what is the man made out of? Right? Well, it says God formed man from the dust of the ground. It doesn't say that God formed man of dust plus something non-physical. The man was formed, and once man was formed, God blew into the man's nostrils the respiration of life. But the man was already made. And the only thing this passage says he was made out of is dirt. Okay? That's a really important thing to take note of here. The man is made of dirt. Okay. Now, let's look at some other passages real briefly that show that ancient Israelites understood that humans are literally made of dirt. We have Genesis 3:19, "For you are dust, and you shall return to dust." Okay, clearly you are dust. Man was made of dirt. Genesis 18:27, Abraham is speaking here, and he says, "I am dust and ashes." Psalm 103:14, "For he knows how we are made. He remembers that we are dust." All right, so very clearly, this is just the common view of human nature held by the ancient authors of these texts. So the word nephesh here clearly isn't referring to something that was put into the human. It is the human, and the human is organized dirt, organized matter. And that's very, very different from the idea that nephesh refers to some immaterial part of a human that can exist separate from the body. This text doesn't treat the body as being only a part of the human. It treats the body itself as being the human, and the human as becoming a living nephesh. So everything involved here is purely physical. And again, check out that short for more of the details. Okay, so now that we've seen that nephesh does not mean what the English word soul means, let's go and take a look at what it does mean. And what we'll see is that the English words that best capture the true meaning of nephesh are the words breath and breather. And we're going to be coming back to Genesis 2:7 in a little bit. And we're going to see that more clearly, that in this passage, nephesh is best translated breather. But we're not quite ready to get into that just yet. First, we're going to start with looking at instances of nephesh meaning breath. All right, so we're looking at 1 Kings 17:21-22 here. And in this passage, it has some interesting similarities to what we just saw in Genesis 2:7. Okay, so let's read this. "He stretched himself on the child 3 times and cried to Yahweh and said, 'Yahweh my God, please let this child's breath come into him again.' Yahweh listened to the voice of Elijah, and the breath of the child came into him again, and he revived." Okay, so there's this dead child, right? He's no longer breathing. And Elijah asks God to have the boy's breath return. And when it does, when the boy starts breathing again, the boy comes back to life. Now, while the boy was dead, he had no breath and thus no life, much like the creation account that we just read in Genesis 2:7, where the man began living only after he began breathing. So in 1 Kings here, the boy dies, right? He stops breathing. And once the boy begins breathing again, once his breath comes back, he starts breathing, he's no longer dead, he's living. So here we have an instance of nephesh clearly having the meaning of breath. All right, next we'll look at this passage from 2 Samuel 1:9. And some of the context is that this is a man who was in battle with King Saul, on the same side as him. But then he's reporting to David after Saul died. So this is what he's telling David. And he, Saul, said to me, "Please stand over me and kill me, since the convulsing has taken hold of me while my breath is all still in me." All right, so here we see that Saul, he's mortally wounded. He started convulsing, but he's still alive. He's still breathing. So he asks this guy who's, reporting the story to David, he asks this man to put him out of his misery because he's still breathing. He's still alive. So please, stand over me and kill me. So here again, we see the word nephesh conveying the meaning of breath. All right, and just one more here for breath. This is Jeremiah 15, verse 9. "The progenitress of 7 done languished. She done blew her breath." Okay, so progenitress there, that's referring to a woman who has gotten pregnant and given birth. Okay, and she's done this 7 times. Clearly she's worn out and she done blew her breath. She blows her breath. Something worth taking note of here is that the word there, blew, that's the same Hebrew word that's in Genesis 2:7 when it says God blew into the man's nostrils the respiration of life. So, when we blow, we blow whatever is in our lungs. And what we all have in our lungs is air, right? Nephesh clearly doesn't mean here what soul means. The most clear and obvious meaning of nephesh in this passage is breath. All right, next we're going to look at some examples of nephesh meaning breather. And if you're wondering, how is it that nephesh can mean both breath and breather, I want to give you an illustration that I think should help, because we have the same sort of thing in English. Okay, take the word stamp. Stamp can refer to something that makes a mark, something that stamps, but it can also refer to the mark itself. It's the same sort of thing with the word nephesh. Nephesh can refer to something that breathes, or it can refer to the breath itself. So now that we've seen already how nephesh can refer to breath, let's move on to the examples of nephesh meaning breather. And again, a breather is something that breathes. Now, we have a body part that ancient Israelites noticed was instrumental in breathing, right? That's our throat. And there's good reason to call the throat a breather rather than like the nose or the mouth. You can breathe through your nose or your mouth, but neither of them is essential for breathing. You can plug your nose and you can still breathe through your mouth, or you can close your mouth and still breathe through your nose. But if your throat is blocked off, you can't breathe at all, right? So the throat is an essential part of the body required for breathing. It's one of its main functions. And that's often why things get named what they do. They get named based on what they're designed to do, or, what their function is, or what they're capable of doing. And maybe another good example for that would be the nose. Like we have our nose, right? And our nose is useful for smelling things. Like that's one of its main functions, is for smelling. And without our nose in working order, we can't tell what things smell like. Now, because smelling is one of the main functions of the nose, people sometimes call a nose a sniffer, right? You ever called your nose a sniffer? Well, we can do that even when we're not talking about smelling something. We might refer to our nose as a sniffer, like if we have a cold and you have a runny nose, or if you have a child with a runny nose, you might say something like, "You need to wipe your sniffer," right? Well, smelling isn't the focus of what you just said, but you called the nose a sniffer anyway. And that's kind of a similar scenario here. Ancient Israelites did the same sort of thing when referring to the throat as a nephesh. They sometimes called it a nephesh even when the focus wasn't on breathing, but was on some other functions like talking or eating. Okay, so let's look at some of these examples here. You'll see more clearly as we go what I mean by that. So we'll start with Genesis 27, verse 4. And this is Isaac speaking to his son Esau. Isaac says, "And work for me tasties like what I done love, and get them to me and let me eat, so that my breather may bless you before I die." Okay, so you guys may know the story here. This is when Isaac, he's close to dying, and he wants to make sure to place his blessing upon his firstborn, Esau, before he dies. But then, Jacob comes in while Esau's out hunting, and he pretends to be Esau, and Isaac blesses Jacob, right? And how does Isaac bless Jacob? Well, he does so by speaking. And how do we speak? Well, it requires breath moving over our vocal cords through the throat, through the breather. Okay, so here we see the word nephesh being used with the meaning breather with reference to the throat. It's not being used with reference to a non-physical aspect of a human. Okay, next we'll look at Jonah chapter 2, verse 5. In Hebrew, it's verse 6, okay, in case you're wanting to compare those. Here's how it reads. "Waters done encompassed me up to my breather. The deep would surround me. Seaweed was done wrapped around my head." Okay, now this is the poem that Jonah wrote while he was in the fish, okay? And the idea here is that he's submerged in water up to the neck or throat, right? Up to his breather, his nephesh. So there we have another instance of nephesh meaning breather as in throat, and definitely not in regard to a non-physical aspect of a human. Okay, and now we'll look at Psalm 105, verse 18. "They done afflicted his feet in fetters, his breather done got in iron." All right, so you probably get the picture, right? The guy is a prisoner and he's been put in restraints. He has his feet are in shackles and there's an iron band around his neck, right? Or his throat, his breather. Now keep in mind the Hebrew word translated breather is nephesh, okay? This is the same word people commonly translate as soul. Now let me ask you, can something non-physical be captured in iron bands? Obviously not, right? The clear meaning of nephesh here is a body part. Okay, just one more for this section. Ecclesiastes 6, verse 7. "All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the breather will not be filled." Okay, so people work for the purpose of being able to eat, right? And it's not like you can put food down your throat one time and never need to eat again. So the nephesh in this passage is clearly a body part, and it's a body part involved in eating. And we can know that because of the context. In the first half of the verse, it says the labor of man is for his mouth. Okay, so that's clearly a reference to eating. But the second half where it says, "but the breather will not be filled," it's obvious that the breather, the nephesh, is something that your food enters and yet it doesn't get filled. Okay, so obviously this is really different from the idea of a soul, something immaterial separate from the body. Here, nephesh is clearly a body part that's involved in normal bodily functions like eating. Okay, so those are a few examples of nephesh meaning breather as in throat. But nephesh is also used in the Hebrew scriptures to mean breather as in a being that breathes. So now we're going to take a second look at those passages in Genesis that we looked at early on when we were focused on showing that the Hebrew word nephesh doesn't mean the same thing as the English word soul. But this time we're going to be looking at them with the Hebrew word nephesh translated into English. All right, so here's Genesis 1, verse 20 again. God said, "Let the waters abound with living breathers." Okay, now as you probably know, many water creatures have to come above the surface of the water so that they can breathe air. Whales do this, dolphins do this, sea turtles do this, seals do this, the list goes on and on. If Israelites knew of any of these animals, they could easily know that they breathe. And they might have even known that fish breathe as well, even though they stay in the water when doing so. They just breathe differently. And when fish are out of water, they really look like they're trying to breathe. But the point here is that all of these water creatures depend upon breathing to stay alive. So they are living breathers. Okay, Genesis 1:24. Here God says, "Let the earth produce living breathers after their kind, livestock, creeping things, and animals of the earth after their kind." And it was so. Here again, the Hebrew word translated breathers is the word Néfesh. And as we saw earlier, Néfesh does not and cannot mean an immaterial aspect of humans. The evidence shows that it really does mean breath and breather. And since it would have been obvious to ancient Israelites that land animals breathe, it should come as no surprise that animals would be called breathers. All right, now let's look at Genesis 2:7 again. And as I said earlier, we have a short that explains this verse in greater detail. So if you want to get a fuller understanding of this verse, just be sure to check out that short. But here's what's happening. God forms a human out of dirt. Then he blows air into the human's nostrils, and as a result, the human becomes a living breather. That's what's going on here, okay? Now, if Nephesh really meant what the word soul means, then this verse would be saying that the human made of dirt suddenly dematerialized and became an immaterial, non-physical aspect of the human. But this is clearly not what the text is saying. And there's something else from this verse that we need to consider before we move on. Notice what it says happened to the man after God blew into his nostrils. Man became a living breather. It doesn't say the man became a breather. Okay, it says he became a living breather, and that's really significant. The man was a nephesh even before he started breathing, and it was only after he started breathing that he became a living breather. Okay, consider this. A blender is still a blender even before it's ever used to blend something, right? That's also true for things like sanders, grinders, shredders, the list goes on, okay? These things are named what they are by virtue of what they're designed to do and what they're capable of doing, even if they've not yet performed any of those actions. That same principle applies to the term breather. Okay, now this brings us to a very important point. Most people, when they read this passage, Genesis 2:7, they imagine that this is portraying God as taking dirt from the ground and kind of getting it wet or whatever, kind of like clay is kind of moist, and sculpting it, forming it into a shape of a human, but not actually taking dirt from the ground and making a human body, skin and bones and organs and sinews and all of that. They picture this clay shape, and then God kind of acts like he's blowing into the nostrils, but that it's something immaterial, non-physical, that magically transforms the dirt into a human. But that's just simply not what the text says. It says that God formed man. And what it says God formed man from is just the dust of the ground. Once the man was formed, God blew into his nostrils, not into a spot that would represent nostrils. It's just talking about nostrils as an actual body part, and God blew air into the nostrils. And of course, when you blow air into the nostrils, the air goes into the lungs, right? So what this text is portraying is that there's a human body there with nostrils and lungs to receive the air, the respiration of life that God blows into the man that he just formed. Now, another important point about this text is that in Hebrew, the word translated man here is the word Adam. So Ha-Adam is the man, Adam is man. And this word Adam is just the standard word used to refer to actual humans. It's never used to refer to clay figurines or statues or just shapes of a human. It's always used to refer to an actual human being. So the most natural reading of this text is that God took dirt, organized it into a human body. That means flesh, bones, hair, sinews, whatever, organs, all of that, nostrils and lungs. And once that body was formed, God blew into the nostrils, inflated the lungs with the respiration of life. And then the big change that took place for the man was that he became alive. The change wasn't that this clay suddenly became a man. He was already a man and he was already a breather prior to God blowing into his nostrils. Now, this is important to be aware of as we move on to our final verse. Okay, it's important to realize that to ancient Israelites, being a nephesh, being a breather, didn't inherently imply being alive. They understood that a breather can be either alive or dead. Okay, so let's take a look. This is Numbers 6, verse 6. All the days of his abstaining for Yahweh, he must not get near a dead breather. All right, now this is referring to a Nazirite, someone who has taken a Nazirite vow. All right, that's the vow where you abstain from cutting your hair and abstain from eating or drinking any grape products. Okay, that's part of what's entailed in taking the vow of a Nazirite. Well, another requirement of the Nazirite vow is that you don't go near a corpse. And that's what this verse is talking about. So all the days of his abstaining for Yahweh, so all the days during his Nazirite vow, he must not get near a dead breather. Okay, well, as you see, that word breather is underlined. That's the word nephesh translated into English. So here we see this passage referring to a dead body, even though the person's no longer breathing, it's still being called a breather. So this person is a dead breather, or it could be any animal, any dead body. Okay. Now, that might sound kind of odd at first to say dead breather if there's no breathing happening, but that's just because we're not used to it. In principle, it's not really odd at all. As I mentioned earlier, anything that's designed to do a certain thing or is capable of doing that, you can refer to it as that, even if it's not yet performed any of those actions. I gave the blender idea and the shredder and that sort of thing, right? Well, there's another example that I think will also help, and that's with a grasshopper, okay? So grasshoppers are named grasshoppers because that's what they do. When they're alive, they're hopping all over the place, right? And we call grasshoppers grasshoppers even if they're no longer alive. So if you see a dead grasshopper, you still refer to it as a grasshopper. You don't just suddenly stop calling it a grasshopper, right? So this really isn't odd. It's the same in principle. It's just not something that we're necessarily used to, but for ancient Israelites, this was just a standard way of referring to beings that live by breathing, whether they're dead or alive. All right, now let's just let that sink in for a minute. Let's just take note of the stark contrast between the meaning of the English word soul and the meaning of the Hebrew word so commonly translated as soul. Or I should probably say commonly mistranslated as soul. Okay, so as we saw earlier, the word soul is used by most people today to mean an immaterial or non-physical aspect of a human, something separate from the physical body. But as we just saw directly from the scriptures, this just cannot be the meaning of the Hebrew word nephesh, that's commonly translated soul. The Hebrew word nephesh is used to mean things like breather and breath, and is used in the Bible to refer to entirely physical creatures. Not just humans. It's about any creature that lives by breathing. Okay, and that's true whether it's ever started breathing, for the very first time. If it's never yet taken its first breath, it's identified as a breather. And that's true even if it has stopped breathing. So, in other words, if the creature has died. Okay. Now, because of this mistranslation, the word soul in our English Bibles, it often leaves people with an impression that is directly contrary to the true meaning of nephesh. And again, this isn't just about the meaning of a couple of words. Like I said, it's really far bigger than that. It has to do with completely different views of human nature, which has a host of implications on other very important topics related to human nature. And from what we just saw, the ancient authors of these texts did not believe that humans are dualistic beings, part physical and part non-physical. They regarded humans as entirely physical.